Same Saying Survives Amelioration by Nathalie Morasch. When Simone de Beauvoir famously asserted, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," she meant that women are not what people think they are. The goal of my talk is to demonstrate that our investigative practices entail that same-saying survives this kind of amelioration of our representation devices. My view stands in opposition to the standard story about conceptual engineering, which frames amelioration as either a shift of meaning for an existing word or an introduction of a new but related word into our existing vocabulary. Let's call this the distinct saying account. When past applications of woman are privileged in constraining the meaning of woman, then amelioration appears problematic. What's the solution? The solution is to develop an inquiry-centered notion of words. Scientific discoveries and evolving social commitments shape what we meant all along with woman. Inquiry-centered words emerge through our discourse and aren't birthed with fixed meanings. Consider the following excerpt from Katrin Benholz's reporting on the rise of far-right extremism in Germany. The definition of what an extremist is had been far too narrow. It used to be that an extremist was defined as someone who belonged to an extremist organization and was ready to commit violence. But now, an extremist is anyone who is disloyal to the Constitution or doesn't actively stand up for its values. It's a definition that better reflects what the far right can look like today, the kind of new right who often don't have a formal affiliation with an extremist organization, but have anti-constitutional views all the same. What are the main takeaways? The experts learned that extremists need not be formally affiliated with an anti-constitutional organization. Note also how the revised norms for applying extremist crowd out the narrower ones. The two standards of application do not happily coexist side by side. What can we learn from our rational inquiries and how definitions change in the course of these? Hilary Putnam explains whether something is or is not the same kind as this may take an indeterminate amount of scientific investigation to determine. This means that whether something is or is not the same kind as Heinrich Himmler may also take an indeterminate amount of investigation to determine. Gary Ebbs concludes that to see ourselves engaged in rational inquiry is to accept that we learn from others, which in turn presupposes practical judgments of sameness of denotation, or as I say, same-saying across the various stages of the investigation. Learning from ourselves and others about extremism or other objective phenomena presupposes same-saying across changes in definitions for our word extremist. A particularly challenging example for the distinct saying camp is the continuously evolving definition of what constitutes rape. So this will be my next example to analyze. Since the early 90s, the definition has been widened in terms of the activities that constitute rape, the perpetrators who can engage in such activities, and the victims who can experience it. According to the distinct saying camp, such developments are then thought to cause a shift from rape narrow to rape wide, or the same word rape shifts its meaning from rape narrow to rape wide. In the early 1600s, Lord Matthew Hale declared, "The husband cannot be guilty of rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife." Now we have two problems for the distinct saying account. Problem 1. Hale's assertion is strictly speaking true by the narrow standards of application for the word rape narrow. Problem 2. The social justice debate then can only happen at the level of a meta-linguistic negotiation in favor of the word rape wide. This means we cannot, strictly speaking, disagree with Hale's beliefs about rape or marriage because we don't speak the same language. I consider this a very unfortunate result. The solution I propose is to adopt the inquiry-centered notion of words. This allows us to say that when we anchor the application of rape firmly in concerns of bodily integrity and self-determination, this amelioration shapes what we meant with rape all along. We get the preferred result that 1. Hale's assertion is false, and 2. The social justice debate can operate at the object level. The challenge, however, is to make sense of the idea that words emerge through our discourse. This violates the conception that words are birthed with fixed meanings that are then passed on to future speakers, which would be Kripke's story. Reflecting on the variability of games, David Cappelen judges as follows. The use of the same name shows that innovators intended the changes they introduced to be variations on the same game. Cappelen argues that our representation devices, which are our words, are social constructs that behave like these games. Consider the example of the invention of the spaghetti strings by Werner Fischer in the 70s. The problem with the spaghetti strings was that very low-ranking players suddenly were able to beat extremely high-ranking players. Eventually, the Tennis Federation decided to ban these strings, upon pressure from tennis players with sway, as well as because they made the judgment call that they wanted to maintain the complexity of the game, where tennis players did a lot of exchanges also from the net. The tennis community faced new technology that was not governed by the existing rules. Prior to the ban, it was a viable option to simply allow all the players to play with these new spaghetti strings. But due to pressure from players with sway, they stipulated a new rule and forbid playing with these spaghetti strings. The rules of tennis were sharpened, and the Federation did not invent a new game. If languages behave like these games, then we're not consumers of a fixed language game in which past moves in the game fully settle which moves are permissible in the future. This means that the norms of application for a word can change without changing the meaning of the word. So, words emerge through our discourse. We can now say that the word rape can change its definition, or we can ameliorate that representation device without it changing its meaning. What preserves same saying for Cappelen is that I intend to repeat the same word as my interlocutor. On my account, speakers have the intention to repeat the same word due to their commitment to a common inquiry. It is the commitment to a common inquiry that constructs the publicly shared word K, which in turn enables but doesn't always ensure successful communication about Ks. When we use the same word, we signal our commitment to a unified research endeavor. See Schroeter and Schroeter, 2009. In an investigation of objective matters, as opposed to giving expression to our own subjective feelings and emotions, words constitute imperfect tools for keeping our investigations on target. Hilary Putnam and Tyler Birch highlight a key fact about ordinary investigative practices. In an ongoing inquiry about K stuff, we can talk about Ks using the word K, and do so productively, even in the absence of agreement or knowledge about the correct definition for the word K. A strong pull towards the distinct saying camp is the assumption that conventional standards determine meaning. Birch, however, divorces meaning from conventional standards of application. For Birch, conventional standards merely play a role in assessing individual linguistic competence. Minimally competent speakers defer to more competent ones. They welcome corrections of their false norms of application. Think Birch's arthritis thought example. Fully competent speakers either conform to the standards or give reasons for violating them. Birch is adamant that these conventional standards themselves remain revisable. On my view, amelioration is precisely the revision and improvement of those conventional norms of application. A narrow view of amelioration would be one where the improvement leads to a more just social order. This view is defended by Sally Haslanger. A broader view of amelioration would be neutral as to the standards by which we measure that improvement. I am open to either account. The convention is such that to walk is to move on foot at a natural, unhurried gait. This norm is receiving pushback from the disability community since, due to testimonial injustice, not everyone has the same enablements in determining the archetypical applications of words. Whose norms are they? As a non-disabled person, I stumbled at first over Sonora Taylor's use of walk in an interview with Judith Butler, during which both were asserting we're taking a walk together. This is surprising, since Taylor lives with a disability that impairs the autonomous use of her legs. Taylor deliberately engages in an ameliorative use of walk by challenging existing norms of application of our word walk. Taylor's efforts are best understood as aiming to leaving her mark on the archetypical application of walk. She wants to affect the existing use pattern of that powerful word walk, not start a sideshow of walk disability. Taylor's I am walking asserts a relevant disagreement with those defending the traditional norms of application. See also Ball 2019, who makes the same point using the example of marriage. Taylor identified a branching moment for our word walk. Sometimes we face representational choices that put pressure on existing norms of application, from unanticipated scientific discoveries, such as finding thousands of additional objects in the Kuiper Belt, which sharpened the definition of planet, or from social developments, such as normalizing walking with a wheelchair. Gary Ebbs identifies the phenomenon of branching. A given pattern of application of a term may be extended in different ways as a result of treating different applications of a term as paradigmatic. The discovery of platinum in the midst of developing atomic chemistry momentarily branched gold talk. We have branch A. Gold is true of X if and only if X is atomic number 79, and branch B, the word gold is true of X if and only if X is atomic number 78 or 79. Ebbs demonstrates how, due to Putnam's division of linguistic labor across time, entrenching branch A doesn't change the extension of gold, and at the same time detaches branch B from our existing practices. Our commitment of embracing branch A sharpened what we meant with the word gold all along. Platinum isn't gold and never has been. New scientific discoveries or social developments open up different but equally accurate branches and force us to choose between competing characterizations of the extension. When not all branches lead to the same social order or way of life, the investigation is ripe for amelioration. Framing power as agential impeded its inquiry. Foucault's work helped ingrain the power-wide branch. Structural power has always been of our extension of the word power. In contrast, power narrow talk would have rendered many forms of oppression hard to pin down and possibly invisible to those not its target. Relative to that counterfactual, we ended up ameliorating our power concept as it had unfolded until the 70s. The wider standards for power crowd out the narrower standards because we want people to develop an awareness of the full range of processes that discipline us. Informally disenfranchised social groups, who tend not to vote independently of voter suppression tactics, constitutes an operation of social power. This example is taken from Miranda Fricker. In the end, we learned that power can be subjectless. Just for those not in the know, Catholic rosaries are held in hand for keeping track of the correct order of reciting a chain of prayers. When not in use, they are tucked away, not visibly worn around the neck. We could imagine a community where persuasive trendsetters think of David Beckham, guide a fad in which rosaries are treated as mere fashion devices. Let's suppose the Catholic nightmare comes true and the majority of rosaries are worn around the neck. At this point, I'd still say, most people just don't understand what rosaries are. Imagine further that the connection to prayers becomes long forgotten by the majority of users, including Catholics. I envision an atheist community that has entirely forgotten about prayers. What anchors rosaries as religious artifacts is the practice of prayer. In the absence of an accessible notion of prayer at the level of the linguistic community, we also dissolve the Catholic rosary. In that extreme version of my thought example, I must grant that there is a shift in meaning so that rosary, the necklace rosary, let's call that rosary embellish, is a different word from rosary religious, because the two artifacts are embedded in different social practices. In this case, the two communities cannot learn from one another because the other's standards are irrelevant. We simply face distinct words. The picture sketched above is correct for transparently constructed kinds, such as artifacts like rosaries and sofas. While individuals may be wrong about what to do with rosaries, I don't think the community as a whole can be collectively wrong in the long run about such artifacts. In contrast, non-stipulated social kinds, such as gender and extremist, are not transparently constructed, and neither are activities like walking. Amy Thomason describes them as byproduct functions of our, quote, existing beliefs, practices, and existing institutions without depending on their being recognized or accepted for what they are, end quote. There is always the potential of us learning from others, i.e. future experts, that we were collectively wrong about what gender, extremism, and walking are, such that we feel compelled to revise the relevant conventional norms. Sally Haslanger clarifies that sometimes ignorance or ideology masks what we are doing or saying. Hence, we can collectively be significantly wrong about the meaning of our own words. Same saying survives amelioration under the following conditions. There are two possible paths here. Either we have a consensus or an ongoing dispute. If we have a consensus, such as in the extremist case, the ameliorated norms crowd out the traditional ones. The participants in this inquiry into extremism consider themselves to have learned something significant as a result of the shift from the traditional norms to the ameliorated ones. If, on the other hand, the disagreement persists, either the chips haven't fallen or they never will, then amelioration hasn't and maybe won't win over the linguistic community as a whole, such as in the ongoing debate over what constitutes walking or marriage. At this point, we have a shift from the inquiry-centered to the coordination-centered notion of words. When we ameliorate our conventional norms of application for the word K, accurately presenting K should not be our only concern. Haslanger stresses that, quote, we aren't just deciding how to use existing terminology to pick out things in the world, but how to collectively orient ourselves towards the world and each other, end quote. When we ponder the various ways of expanding an existing use pattern, we should take into account that not all branches lead to the same social order. Of the idea that the meaning of any given word is fixed by its past use pattern or associated norms of application, a new notion of word emerges that allows us to say that we discover what a word has meant all along. New scientific discoveries or social developments may lead us to ameliorate our existing norms of application for the word K from the traditional to the ameliorated norms. Same saying survives this kind of amelioration. Women are not what people thought they were.